Today we discuss a cult that collapsed under the weight of assassinations, arson, murder plots, and bioterrorism. This is the true story of the Rajneesh Cult. Roll intro. Contain, control, and remove the threat of an invasion by an alien cult. Poverty was caused by religion, required to wear rubber gloves and condoms. He was very against marriage, injected her husband to kill him, while the Rajneesh cult would rise to more or less infamy in the United States in the 1980s. Before we get into that and all of the criminality and horrendous things that the cult did, I think first we need to talk about the origins of the cult and the origins of the cult's leader. And the man who started it all, his name was Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. He was also later be known as Osho Rajneesh, among a couple other different names. But for the sake of this video, I'm just gonna probably stick to calling him Raj, because that's simple and it's cool. So our boy Raj was born originally named Chandra Mohan Jain in Kuchwada, India in 1931. For all of his education, his early life, and the start of the cult all takes place in India up until basically 1981. To go over his early life, he was always super into spirituality, philosophy, and religion. He got a bachelor's degree from the University of Jabalpur in 1955, and then he began teaching there only 2 years later in 1957. Teaching religion and philosophy. And during the time he was a teacher, he would also go on to get a master's degree from the University of Saugar. I don't know how you say that. But the event that led him to start a cult actually happened while he was still getting his bachelor's in college. At the age of 21, he said he had an intense spiritual awakening, which inspired in him the belief that individual religious experience is a central fact of spiritual life, and that such experiences cannot be organized into any single belief system. Hello, Stinky. It was after about 15 years that our boy Raj would go on to take all of his beliefs and teachings and basic principles for his neo-Sannyasins religion into a single manifesto. And this is kind of the birth of the cult, is when he creates this manifesto and decides to leave teaching. Some of the things in his manifesto was he wanted to replace the secular lifestyle of big cities with communal spiritual lifestyles. He was very against marriage, strongly believed in the principle of free love. He was an extreme supporter of both contraception and abortion, wanting to prevent the birth of any children in any of his communes, or the birth of children by any of his followers whatsoever. And basically his hypersexual anti-children teachings is what attracted so many people to his cult, more or less. He also stated things like that he believed that all other religions were failed experiments that were man-made, and that he believed that his movement would succeed because since there was no extreme dogma, that nobody could criticize it because it didn't have any dogma, which to me kind of feels like a cop-out, but that's what he was on about. He was also very pro-capitalism and pro-consumer, and thought that poverty was caused by religion, and that a world without organized religion other than his would be a world that would cease to have poverty. So basically, in the late 1960s, leading into the early 1970s, he finds a couple investors willing to invest in building a series of meditation retreats and a meditation temple, basically called an ashram, in Pune, India. And it's at this point where he starts to gain a lot of followers and the cult kind of develops. He was teaching his followers things at this time, things like to live fully without being attached to the world. One of the key notes was that everyone dressed in red robes and wore a necklace with 108 beads. And the necklace would feature a little photo of him, so everyone had necklaces with the photo of him. I don't know what the significance of the 108 beads is. I should have looked that up, but I did not. And his cult pretty much blows up, and it blows up pretty quickly. He starts to gain lots of following. His beliefs start spreading all across the globe. He gets a ton of followers. He starts multiple other businesses, kind of has this little business empire, and starts amassing a fairly large amount of wealth, both between donations from all of his disciples and profits from all of his businesses that he starts. He kind of gets a little business empire. Like I said, he's very pro-capitalist and was very capitalist mindset oriented. So multiple businesses under his belt. And you might be wondering, well, if everything is going so well for him, what is it that leads him to leave India and come to America when everything seemingly was going so well with him? But basically that comes down to the ruling governmental party in India called the Janata Party. There was a lot of pushback against him and his beliefs and his cult, and there was a lot of tension between the government and him and the expansion of his little cult empire, basically. They started going after him in multiple ways, stopping the physical expansion of the ashram, the temples, his properties, blocking him at every chance they could, as well as they started hitting him with all sorts of back taxes and fines, estimated to be around $5 million then, which would be a lot more now in today's money. And it was also during this early time where he faced some assassination attempts, including during one of his teaching sessions, somebody threw knives at him trying to kill him. And between the government and the assassination attempts, he decides that they should try to leave and find a better place where they can just practice their beliefs safely and everyone will just leave them alone. And it's at this point that he turns to the person who had kind of become his most trusted advisor and was more or less his assistant, known as Mon Anand Sheela. And this is where we kind of get introduced to the quote-unquote villain of our story. As we get into it more and more, you will see a lot of the problems, a lot of the issues, a lot of the crimes and illegal things that were happening kind of all trace back to Ma Anand Sheela, and I'm just going to call her Sheela from now on. And it was her, along with her husband, that found a 64,000 acre plot of land in Oregon in the United States, and they purchased this, and this land was known as the Big Muddy Ranch. And she purchased this with the help of her husband. Now, this is where one of the first big red flags come up, because when I was doing my research, some of the things says her husband Mark Silverman helped her, and some of the other things said that her husband John Shelfer helped her buy this property. So I said, okay, what's going on here? Clearly somebody attributed the wrong husband. But it come to find out, Sheela actually has 3 husbands. The first one actually died while they were still in India at 33 years old. And Mark was battling Hodgkin's disease, but there is testimony from other people within the cult that said that she had confessed to them that she had actually injected her husband to kill him the night he died, and it was only a few months after this alleged murder of her first husband that she married her second husband, which is Joseph Shelfer, and he's the one that helps Sheela buy the property in Oregon because he was this big New York City banking officer who was very wealthy and had great connections in the United States and was a devoted follower of the cult. And he would also help Sheela run lots of things, becoming the executives of many of the companies that I mentioned that Raj owned and ran, because as the story goes on, Raj will just give more and more control of everything over to Sheela, and she kind of becomes the mastermind of everything as we move from India to the United States. Raj takes a big step back. Sheela takes a huge step forward, coming to control and power over everything that's going on. And to back up even more of the claims that she potentially killed her first husband, when the cult falls apart, it's her second husband actually flees, saying that he feared for his life and would later divorce Sheela. So right off the bat, you can see where I'm coming at this with she has villain vibes, when there are claims of her murdering her first husband and her second husband leaving her for fear of his own life. So anyways, they buy this 64,000 acre plot of land, the Big Muddy Ranch, for around $5.75 million, which would be about $20 million in today's money. And they are going to turn this into the perfect city for the entire cult, for Raj and all of his followers. They don't waste any time doing this. They get right into it and they just make things happen. Basically a ton of the Rajneesh, by command of Raj himself, they sell everything they own, they pack up everything they have, and they move with Raj and Sheela to this place and they build up their own city compound. It's stated that within the first 3 years that they had power, plumbing, roads, a shopping mall, an airport with a full-size airstrip, a pizza parlor, a 10,000 person meditation building. They got their own zip code from the United States government for this place because it was so big. They had a fire department, a police department, restaurants, malls, hundreds of townhouses to house everybody. They had a public transit system. They used buses. They had a sewage reclamation plant and a reservoir, and they basically just built this place up as like an entire city within just a few years. Like I said, it took them about 3 years to build this into a full-fledged city. The lowest estimate of people who lived there by the end of the 3 years was 7,000, but more than likely it was actually way more than that because a lot of the people who came did not come legally. They either came illegally, they said they were coming for a medical procedure, and then just stayed and never left. And that's actually what Raj does, which gets him to a lot of trouble later. There's also a whole bunch of marriage of convenience going on. So basically, even though the cult didn't believe in marriage, they had all these marriages on paper with the United States government, basically where cult members who weren't American citizens would marry other cult members who were American citizens to get citizenship to be able to legally stay in the commune that they built. They also had a fully environmentally sustainable farm with solar power, irrigation, and dams. And they basically transform this desert into this like lush green oasis. Hi, Stinky. But despite how great everything was going for the Rajneesh Cult as they move into Oregon, it didn't take long for them to make lots of enemies, both with the local people as well as the government itself. And the primary thing that kicks off the conflict is the town of Antelope, Oregon, which was a town with less than 100 local residents. They did not like the cult at all whatsoever, and the cult quickly starts basically taking over their small town community. And the people in this small town of Antelope, they didn't want them to be able to take it over. So they planned to vote to like make the town no longer a town so that Rajneesh couldn't take it over to have like a legal claim to like have their own city. But so many of them had bought houses in the area that they were allowed to vote. So they basically forcibly take over the town. They renamed the town Rajneesh Puram. They just completely take control of it. And it's at this time where all sorts of land disputes start to happen. They didn't have proper zoning for most of the things they built on the ranch because they had bought it and said, hey, this is going to be like a farming commune ranch and not a full-fledged city like I talk about. They built like a full-fledged city. So there's all sorts of zoning conflicts. They take over this town and the locals are extremely mad at them for taking over the town. And all these litigations start to form. Gets to the point where like activist groups become involved, including the 1,000 Friends of Oregon, as well as in 1982, local residents form a group called the Citizens for Constitutional Cities. Their basically entire goal as an organization was to oppose the ranch's development and the expansion of any kind of the Rajneesh cult at all whatsoever. That group files a petition with the state governor to, quote, contain, control, and remove the threat of an invasion by an alien cult. And if that doesn't say, like, how well they're getting along, I don't know what will, because clearly, like, the locals are just absolutely hating on these guys. Another thing which only adds to the tension is the cult starts what they call the World Festival in 1982, which would be an annual festival where about 15,000 followers who didn't move to the new commune in Oregon would all come to visit for like a short amount of time and basically more or less just kind of throw a rager, you know what I mean? Like just a huge party celebration group thing where, yeah, like I said, 15,000 people were come. And this only just makes the people of Oregon even more frustrated. Because like I said, these are small rural towns surrounding the cult's ranch. And just imagine if you lived in a small rural town and then the cult, which is right next door, who you don't like, has 15,000 people just roll in and just take over the area for like weeks at a time, I really understand. It was a year later in 1983 that the next thing that would really ratchet up tensions would happen, and that was the bombing of Hotel Rajneesh, which was a hotel that they owned and operated that ran out of Portland, Oregon. And this wasn't bombed by locals, let me make this clear. This was actually bombed by an Islamist militant group called Jamaat ul Fukra, and this just further heightened tensions because after this bombing, the cult starts to get paranoid and they start what they called the Rajneesh Puram Peace Force. This was basically militia that started to protect the cult and the cult's properties. The Peace Force was heavily armed with, quote, Uzi Model B carbines, Galil rifles, Ruger Mini 14 carbines, M1A rifles, Car 15 carbines, Ruger Model 44 carbines, Smith & Wesson .357 revolvers, and as well as armored vehicles and tank-like vehicles, as well as like different types of Hummers and SUVs. And these guys would literally like patrol and protect the ranch. So this just made the people in Oregon even more terrified of this cult, seeing how heavily armed and defensive they were, and they were worried that the cult would turn from defensive to go on the offensive. It's also around this time in 1983 that a lawsuit was filed by the state of Oregon to invalidate the city's incorporation, basically saying they're not allowed to be a real city. And they also claimed that since the organization was a religious entity, that they couldn't be a city because of the separation of church and state. That's basically what this lawsuit that started in 1983 said. There was a lot of religious tensions as well going into this at the time. The people of Rajneesh said that the people in Oregon were both bigoted and suffered from religious intolerance because they felt like they had made peaceful overtures to the local communities when they arrived in Oregon and were just absolutely rejected. But then fundamentally Christian church leaders in the area denounced the commune and its followers. Churches in the area started creating petitions to rid the state of the commune, and they would write things in the papers, such as referring to Rajneesh Puram as Sodom and Gomorrah. Another religious group wrote in a paper that they were the cancer in our midst. And this also started to bleed over into hunting magazines and hunting culture because Oregon is a huge state for hunting. Both in hunting magazines and gun clubs and country clubs, things started to be printed or posted up talking about like it was open season on the Rajneesh. They also started calling them the red rats or the red vermin who needed to be exterminated, mostly because they wore those red uniforms. That's where the red comes from. And here's a quote from one of the locals who held this belief, who said, "They're invading, maybe not with bullets, but with money and immoral sex." Which, like I said, this cult was basically a pro-capitalist money and sex cult. So he's not terribly far off in his like take on what the cult was. And the money thing only became more severe, especially for Raj himself personally upon coming to America. Some of the things he did with the wealth he had amassed was buy multi-million-dollar jewelry, which he would wear at all times, as well as bought the largest collection of Rolls Royces ever owned, which I believe it was 93 Rolls Royces. So he just became obsessed with luxury goods. Allegedly, he had a giant covered pool built for him with a luxury trailer next to it, and he would hang out in his trailer most of the time and go hang out in the pool. As the controversies grew larger and larger and the pushback from both the state and the other locals intensified, he kind of withdrew more and more to himself, to the point where when he wasn't in his trailer or his swimming pool, he would only do drive-bys of his followers and play recorded teachings instead of going and actually teaching himself. So basically, he would do this thing where he would get in one of his 93 Rolls Royces and he would drive down like the main road of the city he built, and like all the followers would have to come out, watch him drive by in his little like parade caravan, and he'd be waving at them with all of his bling, and they'd be waving back, and they'd be like, "Ah, it's the Raj," and he'd be like, "Sup, bruh?" You know, I'll throw some pictures up of both him doing that and all of his cars because it's really funny to me, but it's kind of extreme. But as he fully recedes out of the public eye and away from all of his followers, it's at this point where Sheila kind of gets full power. He gives her full power of attorney and full power over all of his companies, and he also gives her full power over the cult. She becomes his talking head, his in-between, his main representative. At this point, he's basically only talking to her, his caretaker, who is also his girlfriend, which is known as Ma Yoga Vivek, his couple doctors. He had a dentist, who will become relevant later, and a personal doctor. And it's at this point where Sheila takes over that things start really kind of going off the rails as far as both the teachings and the actions of the cult against the local people of Oregon. For example, one of the things that Sheila claims that Raj told her, but was never substantiated that he actually said this, was that he had predicted the death of 2/3 of humanity from AIDS. And because of this, everyone in the cult were required to wear rubber gloves and condoms if they had sex, and they banned kissing in the entire cult. So basically you have this money and sex cult where kissing gets completely banned, and if you are going to partake in the free love sex, you must be wearing rubber gloves and condoms at all times, no exceptions. If you're caught, you're in trouble, which was kind of absurd, but we would later come to find out that her second husband actually dies from AIDS, so they're pretty sure that this whole thing from Sheila was coming from the fact that her husband contracts AIDS. She gets really upset that her husband contracts AIDS and takes it out on the entire cult, because I'm sure her husband was sleeping around with all the people in the cult, you know, because the whole free sex thing. But Sheila became increasingly hostile both with other leaders of the cult, the general community in the cult, as well as Oregon at large, being the one to handle all these legal disputes and battles. It's noted that she was very crude and caustic and defensive in all of her interactions, attracted a ton of negative media attention for the cult because she just handled things extraordinarily poorly and aggressive. And when things kind of hit the boiling point, as we get to the whole bioterrorism thing, Sheila announces that the Rajneesh plan to build another entire city on a mountain in 1984. And it's at this point where the state intervenes, denying all the permits and saying that they aren't allowed to expand the cult any further, especially considering all these other legal battles that are going on whether the current buildings and community they have is even legally built in the first place. So Sheila decides that the only solution to both protect the cult and expand the cult is to basically take over the state government in Oregon. And this is where they announce that one of the people in the cult is running for state legislator, which if they got in would give them theoretically enough power to get things kind of moving again on the things that they wanted to do in the state. And they also would plan to have other people run for other different major important political roles in Oregon as they opened up. And her plan to get these people elected initially was that she bussed in thousands of homeless people from nearby states and areas and tried to have all of them registered to vote in the election so that she could sway the election to take over the state legislator. But the state saw that she was doing this, didn't want her to take over, cemented into law that these homeless people would not be allowed to vote in that election, and that it was only regular Oregon citizens would be the ones who were allowed to vote. So she comes up at this point with Plan B, and her Plan B is to build a bioweapons lab, and it's in this bioweapons lab where they create Pepsi. Okay, no, I'm joking. I just had to slide a Pepsi joke in there. Every video has to have a Pepsi joke. It's the law. But it was in this bioweapons lab, along with her closely trusted advisors and cult leaders, that they create this liquid that they called salsa, which really was a special sludge concoction that would keep salmonella, an extremely potent strain of salmonella, alive for extended periods of time. And then they proceeded to take this salsa and go to at least 10 local restaurants and contaminate the salad bars and all the food that they possibly could at these restaurants with the salmonella salsa spray. They had it in like little secret spray bottles, and they would just spray it on everything. And the plan was to create a salmonella outbreak epidemic that would get everyone but the Rajneesh sick, and then everyone would be too sick to vote in the elections. So the only people who would be not sick enough to go vote would be the Rajneesh, and they would win the election in a landslide and basically take over the state government of Oregon through this election. That was her literal plan that they actually executed on, which is just, it's mind-blowing. It's insane that this was the conclusion she came to. When she couldn't rig it with homeless people, her other solution was bioterrorism. And it was due to this that 700 people fall ill, 45 people were hospitalized, but thankfully nobody died, and it was very quickly caught on that this was an intentional thing. Well, they didn't initially have proof that the cult was responsible. It was very quickly that several state legislators and government officials became suspicious of Sheila, especially after the whole busing and homeless people thing, that this was her doing. And they pointed the blame at her, even though they didn't have evidence to bring charges against her yet. And it's because of them pointing the blame for this salmonella outbreak on her that it backfired, and that the people of Oregon came together and overwhelmingly voted for all of the anti-Rajneesh candidates in all of the elections statewide. So none of the pro-Rajneesh or cult members won any of the elections that they were trying to get people in to run for to take over this state government. And it was this point, as pressure is mounting against Sheila and the state is trying to find a way to justify coming in and investigating the cult as a whole, that she really goes off the rails. She started manipulating basically everybody in the cult. She starts to threaten people in the cult, try to kill people in the cult. She makes plans to assassinate certain political figures in the United States government in Oregon. One of the big things was there's a scandal where Raj, in a recording, says some very negative things about Sheila and the things she was doing, and basically she edited those things out and put it out, and then people were found out that she had edited out any of the negative things said about her by anybody else in the cult that would go out to the main group in the cult. And there was just a lot of distrust, and the cult starts turning against her. And it's at this point that Sheila, as well as about 20 other of the top officials, basically everyone who was involved with the bioterrorism thing, just abandoned ship. They decide to just flee not only the commune but the country, and they just take off. The moment that she takes off, all these public accusations come out against Sheila, including an attempted murder of Rajneesh's personal physician, who I mentioned earlier, wiretapping and bugging within the commune, including Rajneesh's home, as well as many other public areas and the homes of other leaders. She had poisoned 2 public officials, and there was also a thing where she just straight up had committed arson and had burned down the Wasco County Planning Department. Also, it was at this point where they found out that she had planned the assassination of the Oregon State Attorney, who is Charles H. Turner, as well as the Oregon Attorney General David Frohnmayer, and also had to compile the hit list of other people that they were considering the enemies of the Rajneesh to kill at future times. It was after that she flees to Europe that Rajneesh comes out of his hiding and goes his full bore in against Sheila, basically dogpiling on her. He basically said that she was keeping him in the dark on how bad things were, what was going on, all these crimes she was doing, all these plots against the Oregon people and the Oregon government, and all these assassinations, all the threats against people. He was saying that she was lying to him, basically about everything that was going on. According to him, he thought things were going great. There wasn't any problems, and that most of the issues were minor. He also asserted that the official religious text called Rajneeshism that was published allegedly under his name was actually published by Sheila as a money grab, and he had her robes as well as all the copies of the books burned by his followers in this giant mass book burning. Said things like the other leaders were a gang of fascists. And at one point even described her as Hitler in a red dress. Which, savage. And it was shortly after all these things that he put against her that he tries to also flee the country and basically abandon the cult as well. But trying to leave the country, he actually gets apprehended and caught in North Carolina before he makes it out of the country. And he ends up just entering a plea deal that just deports him instead of trying to stay in America and face like consequences because he doesn't want to be in America anyways. So he ends up just going back to India and revives his ashram in Pune, India, where he would continue to be a religious leader until his death. And it wasn't long after that Rajneesh was deported that Sheila was actually arrested in West Germany and extradited back to the United States to face many charges, including immigration fraud, attempted murder, and the whole bioterrorism thing, as well as the 2 assassination plots on the 2 guys that I had mentioned earlier. And Sheila ends up pleading guilty on July 22nd, 1986 to first-degree assault and conspiracy to commit assault against Hulse and second-degree assault against Matthew, the 2 guys she had planned to assassinate. She also pleaded guilty to setting fire to a county office and wiretapping at the commune. And for all those crimes, Sheila was sentenced to 3 20-year terms in federal prison, which was reduced to 4.5 years, which she was allowed to serve concurrently, so meaning like she serves the sentences at the same time, and was fined $470,000. But it's worse than that because Sheila didn't even serve out the full 4.5 years. She actually got out after 29 months for good behavior. This woman literally, for sure, tried to commit multiple murders, if not did murder people, because there are several people she allegedly murdered, including her first husband and some of the people in the cult. She also committed that bioterrorism attack, which got 700 people sick with an illness that could have killed them. And she ended up only serving those 29 months in US prison, which is just, it is wild to me. It was after that where she goes off to Switzerland, marrying her 3rd husband, and that's basically where she lived out the rest of her life. She later was tried again in Switzerland for the bioterrorism thing, but her sentence after being found guilty was a sentence which was time already served, so she didn't get any further punishment. Her punishment for that sentencing was the punishment you already had, that was good enough, which is just, it's insane that she gets off so easy for all of these crimes that she was the mastermind of behind all of these things, and she just gets off on 29 months and $470,000 fine. And when Rajneesh was deported, he actually tried to go to 20 other different countries before he went to India. All of those countries refused him because of all the controversy. So that's why he ends up going back to India despite the earlier controversies in India that led him to leave in the first place. And well, he did live out quote unquote fine, continuing his teachings in India. After his death, many of his disciples believed that he actually had been the victim of government intrigue and had been assassinated by the government in India. And upon his death, they vowed to continue the movement he started. And I'd also like to note that it was when he moved back to India, that's when he started going by Osho Rajneesh, and that's where the whole Osho name comes from that he's also known for. And that's why at this point they renamed his place the Osho International Meditation Resort, which apparently hundreds of thousands of people go to every single year, which is crazy. And his cult is still active in over 750 meditation centers in over 80 countries to this day, actually. So the cult pretty alive and well despite everything that happened in Oregon. And you might be thinking, okay, well, what happens to the commune in Oregon and all of the people who were living at the commune in Oregon? It's pretty simple. Since all the leadership was fleeing the country, it basically collapses in upon itself. Anyone who was there in the country illegally basically tried to flee the country and get back to their home countries to not face any consequences from that. Most of the people who are from America just moved back to their hometowns. Well, the actual lawsuit that was saying that it wasn't legal for the city of Rajneeshpuram to exist actually got dropped. They actually did have a legal claim to be a city. By that point, there was no leadership and pretty much everyone had abandoned the city. So it gets scooped up by the United States government and sold at a sheriff's auction for $4.5 million, first to Connecticut General Life Insurance Company, who was the only person who tried to buy it. They thought that they could flip it for a profit, but they actually couldn't. So then they sell it a few years later to a man named Dennis R. Washington, who had the Washington Construction firm. So he buys the ranch, and at first his plan was to try to run the ranch as a for-profit ranch, like just a regular ranch. When that doesn't work, he tries to turn it into a state park. And when the state government is like, no, we don't want anything to do with this cursed place, then he decides to donate it as a tax write-off to the Christian youth organization Young Life. And to this day, the cult campus, this sex cult compound, now operates as a Christian church camp for teenagers. And they have 2 camps, actually, not just one. They split it into 2 camps. So there's the Washington Family Ranch Canyon, and that serves the high school students. And then there's the Washington Family Ranch Creekside, and that serves middle school students. And it's so crazy to me to think that there's all these Christian kids who believe in God, and they go to what used to be a freaky sex cult, anti-religion cult commune for some church summer camp. And they're like having their first kiss, getting their first girlfriend, learning about Jesus, like in this like group sex, free love compound that was built by the bioterrorism cult. So it's the whole thing is pretty wild. But before we end out the video, I just wanted to end on what are Rajneesh's quote-unquote 10 commandments. And while he didn't write these seriously, somebody asked him, if you were going to write 10 commandments, what would they be? And these are his 10 commandments. Never obey anyone's command unless it is coming from within you also. There is no God other than life itself. Truth is within you. Do not search for it elsewhere. Love is prayer. To become nothingness is the door to truth. Nothingness itself is the means, and the goal is attainment. Life is now and here. Live wakefully. Do not swim. Float. Die each moment so that you can be anew each moment. And do not search. That which is. Stop and see. Thank you so much for watching. I will catch you in the next one. As always, if there's something you want me to talk about, let me know in the comments down below. And I will see you next time. Bye! Club. That's what he was on about. Nothingness. Blah.